All right, welcome to The Explainer. I am so excited to get into this one today because we're essentially stepping into a cinematic time machine right back to 1994. So the early 90s actually saw this massive resurgence in the Western genre, right? But honestly, absolutely nothing matches the legendary Hollywood standoff that happened over one single historical figure. Today we're doing a deep dive into this incredible battle between two legendary Westerns, and we're going to focus specifically on Kevin Costner and director Lawrence Kasdan's incredibly dark, historically rigorous 3-hour epic, Wyatt Earp. We're going to pull apart the history, the crazy behind-the-scenes drama, and the really profound questions this film raises about the stories we tell ourselves. Now, to really understand Wyatt Earp, and I mean both the actual man and this specific movie, you absolutely have to understand the rule that governed his entire existence. Quote, "Remember this, all of you. Nothing counts so much as blood. The rest are just strangers." End quote. This line, delivered just perfectly by Gene Hackman, who plays Wyatt's stern father Nicholas Earp, isn't just some throwaway piece of dialogue. It is literally the chilling foundational rule that sets this grim, insular tone for our entire analysis today. Because as you'll see, this intense belief in clan loyalty over absolutely everything else, that's what transforms an idealistic boy into basically the coldest lawman in the West. It's really the ultimate key to understanding the man over the myth. Okay, moving into section 1, the dueling ear epics. So let's look at how a massive disagreement over a movie script birthed two competing Hollywood blockbusters about the exact same guy released just 6 months apart. There was some serious Hollywood ego at play here. Originally, Kevin Costner, who, remember, was at the absolute peak of his career at this point, fresh off his Oscar wins for Dances with Wolves, he was actually attached to make a movie called Tombstone with writer Kevin Jarre. But Costner had a totally different vision. He didn't want this ensemble piece focusing on all the colorful characters hanging around the OK Corral. No, he wanted a definitive, soul-focused biopic. So what did he do? Well, he bolted. He literally left Tombstone, teamed up with his Silverado director Lawrence Kasdan, and decided to make his own massive warts-and-all epic. And in doing so, he effectively split this historical narrative into two fiercely competing projects. And this brilliantly illustrates the philosophical split between those two projects. On the one hand, you've got Tombstone, starring Kurt Russell. That one leaned heavily into the action, the mythic legends of the West, and this really fast-paced ensemble dynamic. You know, it gave audiences exactly what they wanted from a fun Saturday matinee Western. But meanwhile, Costner and Kasdan's Wyatt Earp, they built a sprawling 3-hour and 10-minute character study utterly dedicated to historical fact. It was meant to be this grueling reality check, not a popcorn action flick. Costner was absolutely determined to show the world the real, deeply flawed man. Which brings us to Section 2, Deconstructing the Western Myth. Let's see how this builds into Kasdan's deliberate attempt to completely tear down that shiny, mid-century Hollywood myth of the white knight Western lawman. Because honestly, if your only image of Wyatt Earp comes from John Ford's My Darling Clementine or those old black and white television shows, the unvarnished reality is going to give you a bit of a shock. Critic Pierre Burton actually praised Kasdan's film for showing the true nature of Earp. I mean, he wasn't just this noble guy with a shiny badge. As the film unflinchingly shows us, Wyatt's actual resume included stints as a gambler, a saloon keeper, a pimp, a horse thief, which, by the way, was a crime punishable by hanging back then, and ultimately a cold-blooded killer. Costner and Kasdan just shattered that American hero archetype, and they flat out refused to leave out the ugly facts that the old mythmakers usually just, scrubbed away. So the really crucial question here is, how on earth does a person get to that dark place? Let's trace this tragic trajectory. Back in the 1860s, Wyatt is just an idealistic teenager living in Iowa. By 1870, he sort of achieves the American dream, marrying his childhood sweetheart, Arilla. But when she suddenly dies of typhoid fever while pregnant, something inside Wyatt just shatters. He turns to drinking, he starts drifting. He goes from being a grieving widower in 1870 to a completely hardened, ruthless lawman who tames chaotic cow towns in the 1870s through sheer unflinching intimidation. By the time we hit the 1880s, all that early idealism is completely dead, and he has evolved into a chillingly pragmatic vigilante executioner. Moving right along to Section 3, Blood, Family, and Order. And this brings us right back to that chilling quote from Wyatt's father about loyalty that we started with. Clan loyalty completely 100% drove his terrifying brand of frontier order. The true cost of this absolute devotion to blood culminates in what's known as the Vendetta Ride. It's a dark descent into vigilante justice to basically exterminate his brother's killers. You see, the film portrays the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral not as this triumphant hero's victory, but as a really messy, terrifying close-quarters brawl that just ignites a vicious feud. So when the cowboys retaliate by crippling Wyatt's brother Virgil and murdering his brother Morgan, the legal system completely fails. Wyatt pins on a U.S. Marshal badge, sure, but he completely abandons the actual law. And Costner plays this with such terrifying emotional detachment. He stops arresting men, he simply, methodically exterminates them. All right, Section 4, Cinematic Beauty and Brutality. We really need to shift focus for a second here to just acknowledge the immense technical scale of this film, because capturing 190 minutes of this grim reality, that took an extraordinary cinematic effort. While the story itself is relentlessly dark, the visual craft is honestly nothing short of majestic. Master cinematographer Owen Roizman, who, by the way, shot absolute classics like The Exorcist and Network, he brought this truly sweeping, John Ford-inspired ambition to Wyatt Earp. He expertly manipulates the lighting, the hues, the saturation to convey Wyatt's emotional hardening over time. So as the story progresses from the wide-open, bright hope of Iowa to the literal dust and blood of Tombstone, the colors on screen literally shift to mirror the bleakness inside the protagonist. It's just a gorgeous-looking film, and that beauty contrasts so sharply against the brutal actions of its characters. Now, 40 to 65, that is the staggering amount of weight, in pounds, that actor Dennis Quaid actually lost to play the volatile, tuberculosis-stricken gunslinger Doc Holliday. I mean, it is a legendary display of dedication. Quaid's Holliday is vicious, he's physically deteriorating right in front of us, but he forms this absolutely unbreakable bond with Wyatt. To Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday was the one single man who somehow managed to cross the line from being a stranger to being blood. Honestly, Quaid arguably steals the entire movie. He perfectly grounds Wyatt's stoicism with this chaotic, undeniable humanity. And that brings us to Section 5, the box office gunfight. So, we've seen the history, we've looked at the incredible craft, but what actually happened when this meticulously crafted, somewhat exhausting cinematic giant finally hit theaters against its rival? Well, the reception was polarized, to say the least. Just listen to how Karen James of the New York Times put it. She said watching the film was, quote, like being hit in the head with the butt of a rifle for no good reason at all. Ouch, right? I mean, critics like James and the legendary Roger Ebert, they found the 3-hour runtime to be rambling, unfocused, and genuinely punishing. They felt that Kasdan's absolute commitment to setting the record straight resulted in more of a dry research project rather than, an entertaining movie. For a lot of people, it was just too long and way too relentlessly bleak to endure. But then, right on the other side of the aisle, you had reviewers who completely understood exactly what Costner and Kasdan were trying to do. Kenneth Turan of the LA Times stated that out of the numberless pictures made about Earp, this one is, quote, probably the most true to life. And I think this just brilliantly illustrates the divide here. The film's unparalleled historical fidelity was definitely its greatest strength, but it was also the exact reason it was so incredibly divisive. They absolutely succeeded in tearing down the myth, for sure, but they left audiences with a deeply uninspiring, dark reality. And that brings us to the ultimate financial showdown. Let's look at the numbers. Wyatt Earp had a massive $63 million budget, but it only pulled in $56 million worldwide. I mean, it was a box office bomb. Meanwhile, Tombstone, which had come out just 6 months earlier, was made for a super lean $25 million and grossed a really impressive $73 million. The audience clearly cast their votes with their wallets. They fundamentally rejected Kasdan's exhausting 3-hour historical truth. Instead, they opted for the fast-paced, highly quotable, action-packed legend of Tombstone. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly profound thought to ponder today. If historical reality is almost always darker, slower, and vastly more complicated than the movies, why do we constantly demand the truth only to go to the theater and pay for the legend? Wyatt Earp dared to show us the gritty, uncompromising reality of the American West, and honestly, the world largely looked away. I really hope this explainer gave you a new appreciation for the massive undertaking behind this 1994 epic, and hey, maybe it even sparked your curiosity to go explore both the facts and the fictions of cinematic history for yourself. Thanks so much for joining me.